It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster.
Whatever it costs to deliver this scheme, we will pay it.
In the next hour, victims and families affected by the contaminated blood scandal will learn how they'll be compensated.
Since the Hamas attack on Israel on October the 7th of last year, we've seen a shadow spread across the world and here in the UK.
A warning that Britain risks descending into the darkness if it fails to tackle growing anti-Semitism.
Crawley, as these models indicate, is to grow. It is the second of the new satellite towns.
A swathe of Crawley-style new towns, that's what Labour's promising to build if they win the election. And remember this?
Families who have a third or subsequent child after April 2017 will not receive additional tax credit or UC support for this child.
7 years on, should the two-child benefits cap be scrapped? Joining us today, Conservative MP Sir Alex Shelbrooke, Labour MP Dame Siobhan McDonagh, James Schneider, former advisor to Jeremy Corbyn, a member of Progressive International, and Emma Revel from the centre-right think tank, the Centre for Policy Studies. This is Politics Live. Rishi Sunak said in the Commons yesterday that it was a day of shame for the British state as the damning findings of the inquiry into the contaminated blood scandal were published. Let's have a look at some of the front pages and how they covered the report findings and what unfolded yesterday in Westminster. Daily Mail, tainted blood scandal, day that shames the British state. Let's have a look at how The Mirror covered it and followed the whole scandal. Maybe we can't bring you the front pages, but they talked about compensation. We might be able to show you. Here we go. Infected blood scandal. Make the guilty face justice. These are calls for compensation and those to be prosecuted who were involved in any of the cover-up that was outlined yesterday. And the Metro, chilling verdict on NHS catastrophe, 40 years of bloody cover-up. We heard the Prime Minister in the headlines there, but what does justice look like for the victims of the contaminated blood scandal? Starting with you, Alec.
Well, look, I mean, I think there's been a universal welcoming of the Prime Minister's unequivocal apology yesterday on behalf of the state, which has happened over successive governments. And I think that the mood, certainly around Parliament, is to hope that John Glenn, when he does his announcement, actually outlines not just when what the compensation is, but when it's going to be paid, so that it's going to be brought to an end. Because, look, this is one of the biggest scandals, as has been outlined. And it's taken, decades for a government of any colour. It was 2017 when Theresa May pushed forward for it, and government after government's covered it up, and that's why I think it was right to apologise on behalf of the state, and lessons have got to be learned. But there's a lot more in that report other than just that, but we can come back to that.
Yeah, well, what does justice look like, do you think, Siobhan? I mean, it was unbelievably moving, and we spoke to one of the relatives of someone who died. Her father died as a result of this scandal. And for her, there were a whole range of things that have to be done. What do you think justice looks like?
I'm not sure justice is possible if your loved one has passed as a result of a condition that you inherited from receiving contaminated blood. What justice is there? Of course there needs to be compensation, but it doesn't compensate you for the loss of that person, for the experiences their family, their children had. There does need to be a criminal investigation, but given how far we're on, the likelihood of success you've only got to suspect is slim. But what we've got to do from the memory of these people is to look at how our organisations function. Groupthink, of always being suspicious of the person who says, hang on a minute, are you sure this is right? Why is it that in Ireland they were giving compensation back in 1995? You know, why is it that last year the chair of the inquiry said start giving compensation because 3 people are dying every week? Or why is it that the opposition parties had to get together last December to force a vote to get the mechanisms for compensation in place? I'm not making party political points
No,
here.
because it did actually continue, obviously, all the way through
what I'm
successive
making is
Conservative and Labour
the
governments.
obstacles that there are to challenging the accepted thought, to sustaining reputation rather than being constantly inquiring if you're doing the right thing.
And do you accept, then, that despite the heartfelt apologies, failings of institutions like government, Whitehall, NHS, but governments, Labour and Conservative governments, failed?
Well, I think the institutions, the governments did fail, but on all levels it's about how do you have a culture where you get things done, but at the same time you question the current accepted thought. I see it myself. I spend a lot of my time campaigning for treatments for glioblastoma brain tumours. And, you know, we see trials that can't be taken on board because doctors want to do things the way they've always done them. I'm sure they've got good reason, but we have to be open and challenging to ideas, and that is hard. I understand
Alec,
that.
before I move on.
Yes, I mean, I think Siobhan makes some very important points there. I mean, this morning I've been at the APPG for First Do No Harm, which has made it crystal clear
parliamentary
about
group, just to explain to you.
crystal clear about the redress that needs to take place for people affected by sodium valproate, by Primados, by mesh, and we have hit the wall again, and it's in process. With speed. It's the same excuses all the way through. There is an institutional problem, regardless of government, which just constantly puts the brakes on getting the compensation people need. This is as important as these issues.
Right, but how can we be sure, Rishi Sunak said, and others, that we must make sure such a scandal never happens again? But when you hear of the sort of institutional, cultural issues at the heart of government, Whitehall, NHS, can you be sure it won't happen again?
I don't think we can unless we set up specific institutions whose role it is to investigate the state on a constant basis. So, for example, in South Africa, as part of their constitution, they have a number of offices, including one called the Public Protector. And the role of that office is to take up cases on behalf of citizens who feel like the state has not done the right thing by them, and to have ongoing formal investigations so that there is a structured within the state, there's part of the state that is holding the rest of it accountable. And I'm not saying that in every circumstance that one has been perfect, although it has. Well, it did take the president to court. The president ended up having to leave office. So I think that sort of thing needs to be built into our constitutional framework.
Were you going to say something?
I suppose on a less exultant level, we have a whole series of the Ombudsman services, don't we? But I think it's more than institutional. I think it's about personal responsibility and the need to speak up and stand up. And it's easy to say and difficult to do.
But it's easier to do that if there's a framework for which that to happen. So, for example, let's say you were someone working in the NHS and you were saying to people, I think there's something going wrong with this, I think there's something wrong with this blood, etc. If you had a public body that you could go to that was resourced and that could investigate and that you could trust, then whistleblowers are far more likely to come forward. People are far more likely to do that sort of, yes, I will stand up and I'm not going to take a hit, because it is a formal thing through the state, just another arm of the state which is removed, which is meant to provide scrutiny on the rest of it.
Emma, what do you think justice looks like?
I think for the victims and their families, it does look like an acknowledgement, like the one we had from the Prime Minister yesterday, that, you know, an apology on behalf of the state, on behalf of this government and previous governments. But I think it can only feel like justice if something actually changes. And I think going forward, things need to change. There is a danger, I think, that we view this as a historic inquiry into a historic incident. It's something that happened, you know, in our recent past, but in the past, 30, 40 years ago. And we don't look at it as something that is happening today. You know, Rob Behrens, who, as you said, the NHS Ombudsman, who stepped down earlier this year, as he was stepping down, gave an interview that said the NHS still has a culture of cover-up. It still has a reputation-first, reputation management attitude to any, you know, wrongdoing. And as we saw in the coverage around the birth trauma inquiry a couple of weeks or so ago, these things are not thrown into the light. They're not acknowledged. They're not learned from. There is an instinct within the NHS and other institutions to protect themselves, not to protect the patients that are being damaged.
And as we said, the Cabinet Office Minister John Glenn will be standing up in the next 5 or 10 minutes or so to outline how compensation for the victims and their families will work. We may, you're suggesting we might hear an actual figure, we might not, or a specific timeline, but there have been calls for those payments to be paid out by the end of the year. We'll bring you any developing lines from what he says in that statement. Let's just have a listen to a speech, or part of it, from the Community Secretary, Michael Gove, talking about anti-Semitism.
When Jewish people are under threat, all our freedoms are threatened. The safety of the Jewish community is the canary in the mine. Growing anti-Semitism is a fever which weakens the whole body politic. It is a mark of a society turning to darkness and in on itself.
James, do you agree with that characterisation from Michael Gove, that British society is turning in part towards darkness if anti-Semitism isn't tackled?
I think anti-Semitism is real and is growing, and I think that Michael Gove's use of it and use of Jewish people's pain and fear after centuries of persecution is frankly gross, and the darkness that is spreading is an attempt to present those that are protesting grave crimes which are taking place now with British support, with the support of the British state, with the support of British-made weaponry, and with the support of pretty much the entire British political media class, to say that actually it is the people who are protesting these crimes that are in some way creating darkness is extremely gross, and I think it's doubly gross.
Let me get Alex Shelbrooke to respond to that. Is that how you see it? Do you think Michael Gove is using anti-Semitism?
No, I absolutely don't. And I think that this is one of the fundamental problems that we're facing today. I have a Jewish community in my constituency. Leeds has a proud Jewish community. I am appalled that we have just elected a Green councillor to Leeds City Council who, before that election, and it was called out, deliberately set up a lynch mob, quite frankly, on social media to attack the rabbi at Leeds University because he'd gone to serve at the IDF. All this is documented. If you are Jewish in this country at the moment, you are afraid. And there was a survey out. Well, there was a survey out, and Andrew Neil reported on this yesterday, that 40% of people on university campuses felt it was all right to abuse, if you will, Jewish people because of the consequences. None of this is acceptable at any level of any religion, of any racism, and it has to be called out. It is growing. I think the ICC yesterday equating Hamas and the Israeli government was absolutely appalling, as President Biden himself has called out.
Right. I mean, let's come to that then in a moment and stick with the... Yeah, we can. But let's just stick with the substance of what we've heard first of all, and then we can move on to... of the speech. He talks about descending into darkness. That anti-Semitism is a fever, he says, which weakens the whole body politic. Do you agree with that? Do you agree with the seriousness with which Michael Gove clearly believes that anti-Semitism is infecting parts of society today and growing?
I do, but I think anti-Semitism has always been there on left and right in politics, and that perhaps, you know, the war in Gaza, everything that's happened makes us more aware of it. But it is the oldest prejudice, isn't it? And I am shocked when I talk to people who I think I share a political perspective with, to often find it's there, and for people not to even recognise it themselves. So I think it is very deep-rooted. I don't understand the purpose of Michael Gove's speech or why he's felt important to make it now, but I couldn't disagree that anti-Semitism is a problem.
Right, but he says it's because Jewish hate crimes have tripled in London, and he does say that on some of the pro-Palestinian marches that the demonstrators or the organisers are not doing enough to stop spreading anti-Jewish messages. And that's why he says he's felt compelled to make a speech condemning the rise of anti-Semitism in the UK. I suppose the question is, if he thinks that the spread of anti-Semitism is infecting society, it's been under Conservative governments' watch. Has not enough been done by successive Conservative governments to protect against the rise of anti-Semitism?
Well, I push back and say that under the previous leadership of the Labour Party were reported to the HRC. And that had to be investigated. And as a result of what came out of that, Jeremy Corbyn was expelled from the Labour Party, or lost the Labour parliamentary whip. Well, what's inaccurate about that? Why did Keir Starmer take away the whip of Jeremy Corbyn?
Because Jeremy Corbyn did not accept all the recommendations and findings of that report, in which he said claims of anti-Semitism have been overstated by parts of the media. That is what was said as a result. And yes, he was expelled by Keir Starmer of the party, but expelled from the parliamentary party, and doesn't sit as a Labour MP and sits as an independent. You don't think that was the right decision. Was that the right decision?
Absolutely. I'm ashamed of behaviour in the Labour Party during Jeremy Corbyn's period. And as a member of over 40 years, I couldn't believe what it unleashed.
James?
I'm shocked, I have to say, that I've come here and the day after the International Criminal Court says that issues arrest warrants for the leaders of Israel and the leaders of Hamas, that rather than discussing that, we are talking about historic things in the Labour Party,
hang on, James. That's what other guests have said. That is not about that. Well, of course. And I did say that we would come to the ICC, but you can't sit there, James, and criticise what other guests equal to you want to discuss as a result of a speech on anti-Semitism. And it is not entirely irrelevant to talk about what happened when Jeremy Corbyn was leader.
So you
worked for Jeremy Corbyn as leader. I've just asked you to respond to what you heard from Siobhan McDonough, who says she was ashamed of what happened. You worked for him. You obviously weren't. So defend it.
No, of course not. And what Jeremy said in his statement following the EHRC report is entirely correct, and I encourage people to go and look at it. He said that anti-Semitism exists. One anti-Semite is one too many, that there was a real problem and that action should have been taken faster. And, and that it was dramatically overstated by elements of the media.
Well, that's what I said.
Yes, I know. Let me finish. For political purposes. And that combination, and here's the important point, that combination caused real pain to Jewish people, must not be repeated. And this is what we're seeing with Michael Gove again today, and here is the connection. There is real anti-Semitism. There is real rising anti-Semitism to which people should be concerned and deal with. There is also trumpeted across our media and our politics, Jewish people being frightened, being told that these are hate marches. They are not hate marches. That apparently on campuses... Please wait. Apparently on campuses, people are full of anti-Semitic hatred. I went to one of the encampments the other day, and somebody recognised me from the encampment and came up and said, "You're Jewish, we're doing a series of talks from people on anti-Semitism to educators about anti-Semitism. Will you come and talk about it?" Now, that to me does not seem like a place that is in any way frightening for Jewish people, and it is just that we are told that in the media, which is why people say that London is a no-go zone.
Are you denying all the reports of Jewish people who have come forward to say they do feel intimidated? Not all Jewish people, and not all Jewish people feel that from all of the marches. But there is reporting extensively from university campuses and from those marches that does say Jewish people, some of them, feel afraid. Are you denying that?
I'm not denying that what people's subjective experience might be. Of course not. What I'm saying is if from the floor of Parliament, for example, we're told by MP after MP that a call for genocide was projected onto the Houses of Parliament when it was not, then I would be... I would be
that
extremely...
phrase is known to be an anti-Semitic
No, it is not.
It is.
No, it is
and
not.
you know full well that the reason
Hang
it was
on.
projected was to launch a very undisguised attack on the Jewish community.
No, it wasn't.
That was appalling that phrase was allowed to be put on the side of the House of Commons. Absolutely appalling. And that is leading to people feeling that they've got the right to be anti-Semitic.
Hang on. Let me just inject, and I will let you... From the river to the sea is deemed to be anti Israel, anti the existence of Israel because of the creation of a state that would go from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea. But it is not deemed by everyone to be anti-Semitic in that sense. James, did you want to respond?
It's pure projection, as made again and again, that a call for freedom for all people who live in that geographic area is a call for ethnic cleansing and annexation. Just because that is the State of Israel's long-standing policy does not mean that to say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, is a call to expel or exterminate Jews.
But that is the implication for many people.
It is not the implication.
It is for many people believe that.
That is the main objective of Hamas.
According to its 2017
it wants to destroy the state, the Jewish state of Israel.
It doesn't want the State of Israel.
Right, it doesn't want the Jewish state of Israel to exist. That is the stated aim of Hamas, deemed a terrorist organisation by the UK, US and several other countries. Emma, in the midst of this conversation, what did you make of Michael Gove making a speech about the rise of anti-Semitism and the risks to society?
Well, I think this entire conversation is a good illustration of the fact that different communities, different people can perceive the same words, the same phrases, the same slogans, the same marches in incredibly different ways. And, you know, James saying he doesn't feel unsafe, I'm very glad that you don't, but there are other people who do. And if you have organisations that can say that, well, instances of anti-Semitism have tripled in 2023, the vast majority, I think 2/3 of which came after October 7th, you have stories of children in schools who, you know, tell their parents, I don't want to wear visible symbols of my religion anymore because things are shouted at me in the street. There was a journalist who, on his way to Michael Gove's speech this morning, said, tweeted that, you know, someone drove past the Jewish community centre where the speech was being held and shouted abuse about, you know, killing babies out of a car as he was driving past. These are concrete examples of something that, as Siobhan said, has always existed in society, but very much has become more open, more accepted, more easily seen since October 7th. And I think Michael Gove, as Community Secretary, is right to raise awareness of that fact.
You brought up, both James and Alec, the International Criminal Court, which has announced it's seeking arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the Defence Minister, actually, and 3 Hamas leaders, one of whom is also credited with having masterminded the October 7th massacres in Israel across the Gaza Strip. Yes, it's been condemned. The moral equivalence, there isn't one, says the British government. Do you agree between the Prime Minister of Israel and the leaders of Hamas?
I don't think there is equivalence, though obviously President Netanyahu makes it, you know, thank God. I mean, poor Israel having him as the Prime Minister. But, I mean, I think Labour's position is that we're waiting to see what the lawyer said about whether those arrest warrants will actually be issued.
I mean, interestingly, the leaders of Hamas also say it's ridiculous to put them in any sort of equivalence with the Israeli Prime Minister. What do you make of both sides in terms of who has been sort of condemned or arrest warrants are being sought for?
I think looking at it in terms of equivalence or not is absolutely bizarre. There have been a series of detailed allegations made by the International Criminal Court against 5 individuals, and they should be taken on their merits. The fact that Ismail Haniyeh or Yahya Sinwar was on the same announcement doesn't mean that they committed the same crimes as Yoav Gallant and Benjamin Netanyahu. So I think we should, rather than claiming outrage that justice is being sought for a series of crimes, we should look at the actual crimes themselves, and then we should look at what our role in them is. Please, one moment. Our role in them is, because we're sitting here in London, and we really have no complicity or role whatsoever in the atrocities that Hamas committed against civilians on the 7th of October. But we do have an extreme level of complicity in the crimes that have been committed by the State of Israel against the Palestinian people, including using famine as a weapon of war, using the lack of potable water as a weapon of war.
Israel denies
that
this.
The British political media class carried water for in the days following the 7th of October.
Alec, do you accept that? I mean, the government has said that the amount or the number of arms that are sold to Israel by the British government is very small, but they do still sell arms to Israel while this war is raging. Should they stop?
Well, the government sells a lot of electronic equipment to Israel to make the precision of its weaponry, which is very important when you're trying to limit civilian casualties. If you look at the international rules of war, they say that on average it's 9 civilians to 1 combatant killed. If you look at what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, on average it's been 3 to 1, and some would claim that it's actually a 1-to-1 equivalence in Gaza, because the Israelis are not carpet bombing. They're not doing a collective punishment. They are trying to attack the battalions of Hamas fighters who the war crime they commit is hiding behind the civilian population, not wearing recognised military uniform that is part of the Geneva Convention, and wagging their fingers at all rules of combat. They launched this attack on Israel. Israel has the right to exist, which Hamas does not agree with. We know Iran has its hand all over Hamas, and we know the situation they're calling out around the world in trying to run basically an anti-Semitic regime. That's what Iran does. And on top of that, if we are to say, well, Israel must stop now, I think people who say that are actually equating to a punishment beating. I think that Israel has to reach its military objectives to protect its security, to ensure it has the right to
die.
How
many mass graves
James, we're going to...
So how many babies had their heads smashed against the wall?
Hang on, we're not doing competing...
Mutilated.
Let's not do the competing outrage, OK, at this point. We've discussed this at length. We're going to move on to something entirely different and talk about the Labour Party's commitment to what they call new towns. I can show you the Daily Telegraph headline, which has Angela Rayner, the deputy leader of the Labour Party, stating, "We'll build a generation of Milton Keynes-style new towns." She's been speaking in Leeds, Angela Rayner, this morning, and setting out Labour's plans for these new towns. Let's take a listen to what she had to say.
Our ambition goes way beyond simply reversing the worst failures of the past few years. Not for the first time, we're taking inspiration from that 1945 Labour government that built homes for heroes of the ruins of war. In that spirit of Clement Attlee, our approach to house building will be both proactive and strategic. As Secretary of State, I will empower our regional and local leaders to deliver as Labour councils and mayors do in West Yorkshire. Together, we can build beautiful new settlements right across the UK.
Are new towns the answer to the housing crisis, Emma?
Well, they're not the entire answer. They could well be part of it. And I think, to be fair to the Labour Party, they've said this morning that this is part of a plan. It's not the entire plan. And I think, you know, any indication that a party is going to be more receptive to house building is needed, because at the end of the day, what we have in this country is a phenomenal housing crisis that impacts people all across the country, but especially in cities, London, Cambridge, Oxford, Bristol. Housing is increasingly unaffordable, regardless of the size of house you need or the type of area you want it in. So more house building, you know, is unequivocally a good thing. It's the only thing that's going to get house prices down. I think what will be key is the implementation of this policy. If we do see a Labour government where these new towns are, if they're sort of plonked in the middle of nowhere where people don't really want to live, that doesn't have the infrastructure to support it, well, that's not actually where we need houses. We need them close to jobs, close to where people already want to buy houses. So, you know, it's good. It's a good headline. The implementation will be key. Right.
Is it just a slogan? We don't know where they're going to be built. You won't know yet either. They obviously haven't been decided. But what is the metric, the infrastructure going to be for them?
Well, I'm sure we can make an educated guess where they're going to be. We can be fairly sure they're going to be in the Cambridge Conurbation. We're going to look at large land spaces that are available. As Emma says, they're not the total solution to our housing crisis. I think the Resolution Foundation said this week that the UK has the largest homelessness problem in the world. You know, unless we start building on all sorts of policies. Last night in the House of Commons, I had a debate on temporary accommodation for homeless families. We have 142,000 children currently living in temporary accommodation. And I am sure that I could take any member of this panel to that accommodation and you would not put your pet in it, let alone put a human being in it. And it's a problem that we are not going to resolve without houses being built. Will it cause controversy? Of course it will. Yeah. But is it absolutely imperative to those families, the next generation and our economy? Yes, it is.
Alec, you were nodding away there.
Yeah, because I agree. I think I think for too long we have not built enough houses. I think that is something of the 21st century, quite frankly. I look across my constituents, I see large estates built throughout the 70s and the 80s, and I wonder to myself, how was that done? I remember the adverts with the Barratt's Wimpy helicopter going across talking about new estates. None of these things have been happening. Now, I've had lots
of these are Conservative governments.
Well, I've had lots of developments take place in my constituency, which I haven't opposed, and I've tried to find positive ways forward. I think it was a mistake of the government when it changed hands to get rid of the housing targets that came in. I think anybody who doesn't feel that we need more housing is quite frankly wrong. How it is going
Alex,
to
can
be
you talk
delivered?
To Michael Gove about
well, I mean, I do. But
I don't think he's the villain in all this, though, I have to say.
How it's going to be delivered is the question.
So how do how do you deliver it then?
Well, I mean, the problem always comes up with, I mean, for example, there's an area nearby where my current constituency, which was a plan to build 4,000 houses. But two of the landowners have pulled out of that. There's huge local opposition to it. And I very much doubt it will get built. And the question is, I mean, personally, I think that house building targets were important. There's been so many things done.
You disagree with Rishi Sunak dropping it, or certainly the sanction if you didn't.
I always did disagree. Yeah. I think Liz Truss was right to put in a 300,000 a year housing target. I think that people recognise we need more housing, and I think that it's all very encouraging what the opposition is saying. But I come back to how are you going to do it? Because there's so many barriers you run into along the way. Where's the spirit of the 70s and the 80s where huge estates were built? That hasn't happened in the 21st century.
Right. Well, perhaps we can remind people of the spirit of the 1940s. You can see BBC footage that we're going to show you, I hope, of the then Princess Elizabeth visiting Crawley New Town in Sussex in 1950. Crawley was designated as a new town in January 1947. It was the second of the new satellite towns and built to have a population of 50,000. Modern housing estates and factories. The Princess was there to open the new road through the industrial centre. That was obviously 1950, but how are you going to recapture the spirit of building the sorts of new towns that Alec has talked about in the 70s and 80s?
I think we're beginning to capture it because there's beginning to be people right across society say, actually, yes, we've got to build more houses. I'm amazed that Keir Starmer's took up one of my campaigns, which is to build on the ungreen green belt next to
Is this the grey belt?
Yeah,
yeah. Sounds very convincing,
and the fact that they've taken that with enthusiasm, I find extraordinary, but I think it's a way to get houses built. We need to change the planning system. We need to encourage small and medium-sized house builders in a way they've been forced out of the market in favour of the big ones. And I think we need to think about what we've done to housing associations, in that we have, in a way, destroyed their purpose, and we need to get back to them building properties for themselves with better grant rates in order to ensure that rents aren't so high that people can't afford to go to work to live in them. So I think there's not one thing, there's a whole layers of stuff we should be doing, and it has to be our mission.
Do you think an incoming Labour government under Keir Starmer, if they win, will actually be able to deliver on this promise?
I really hope so, and there is more detail in the announcement from Angela Rayner than is often in these announcements. And there is a pledge in there about building the infrastructure as well, and I think that is positive. But if you're saying, will it be enough? And everyone's saying it's only part of the solution, but it's not enough to deal with the housing crisis, because there are two other very important elements that we need to look at. It's the type of houses that are types of homes that are being built, what tenure, how many are for social rent, and then we have to finally grasp the nettle of rent controls, because the rent is out of kilter with incomes that people can afford. So a lot of the new homes that we build, many people will not be able to afford them, which won't fix the problem.
Do you agree about rent controls, that needs to be part of the policy?
Yeah. Rent controls don't work. They don't work anywhere they've ever been tried. They cause enormous problems. If you are in a rent control property, great, but it's a massive problem for everyone else. It displaces, workers can't move to rent controlled properties because they're not available. It doesn't have the signals that we need to build more. As you said, rent rental levels are a problem in the same way that house prices are a problem, because we don't have enough of them. We are millions of houses short as a country because we've underbuilt for not just the last decade, the last 2, the last 3, the last 4 decades. And at the end of the day, only building houses in significant numbers, as you said, the 300,000 target, shouldn't have been scrapped. That was based on net migration of 170,000 a year. Net migration for the last 2 years has been, 3, 4, 5, 6 times that. So, even that target wasn't enough. We need to build on an industrial scale.
It's kept up with societal change. So, for example, my parents lived with their parents until they got married. My sister and I lived in our own properties and then eventually got married. So even if population hadn't changed, there was a societal shift in children from my parents' generation, those children, my generation, going into their own properties, i.e. doubling the number of properties needed. It was a societal shift not kept up with.
Rent controls, which could just mean rents can't rise above inflation.
Oh, right. Well, that's slightly different, though, isn't it, on the increase?
Have worked in many places, including in this country. For most of the 20th century, we had regulated rents, and housing, all of housing for rent and for to buy, was hugely, hugely more affordable. Now, you're an economist, you'll know that it's not just a supply issue, because housing is not a commodity like a pen, where there's a huge supply of pens. If someone charges me £10 for this pen, I can go across the street and I can buy a pen from a different shop for £1. Housing is not like that. So a landlord can charge close to the monopoly price for rent, and therefore there is a role for the public to step in and to regulate those rents so that they move away from the monopoly rent, or the near monopoly rent that they're able to charge.
Emma?
Well, that is true because we don't have anyone objecting to the creation of pens. We can, pen companies exist. You can have as many pens as you like because you don't have NIMBYs saying, oh, I don't want more pens in my area. We've got enough pens. My kids don't need pens. They'll live with me until they're 40. I agree that, as someone renting in the edge of Zone 1, Zone 2, I very much understand how difficult it is. But the underlying problem behind all of that is that we haven't built enough houses. So actually anything other than building more homes isn't tackling the root cause of the problem.
All right, very briefly, and then we've got to move.
I also think we've got to say what is the role of private renting and what is the role of social housing. And I don't think that private renting is for a family with children where the incomes are low, because the rent is never going to be affordable. The tenure is never going to be secure enough. That we have to go back to saying that there is a role for social housing, and it's a great role that provides the bedrock of community for you to be able to have your family, your children, and have security in the future. It's just this lack of security that so many children have when they move time after time after time, move their school, move their friends, move their family. And I just think we are destroying a generation.
Well, let's have a look at this headline in The Observer on a different policy, but Labour have certainly been encouraged to drop the 2-child benefit cap. Archbishop of Canterbury urges Starmer to ditch cruel, what he calls 2-child benefit cap. You can see former Labour leader in The Independent, Gordon Brown, piles pressure on Keir Starmer over 2-child benefit cap. And then the former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, said this in the House of Commons last week.
A child growing up in poverty, though, Mr. Speaker, is more likely to have worse literacy, numeracy, health and job outcomes and a shorter life expectancy than the national average. Mr. Speaker, isn't it right that the single biggest, most effective thing the government could do now is to scrap the 2-child benefit cap?
Not often that those three people all agree. So isn't it time?
I'm not taking any lectures from Suella Braverman.
But maybe from Gordon Brown, as a former Labour leader, or the Archbishop of Canterbury, Siobhan McDonough. Should Labour scrap the 2-child benefit cap, which prevents parents, by the way, from claiming child tax credit or universal credit for more than 2 children?
I voted against the 2-child cap. I don't like it. But I do understand Keir Starmer's position. Do you not think that we'll get over this hideous bit of welfare reform and then we'll get on to another, and then we'll get accused of spending large amounts of money and we don't know where it's coming from? So at this point in the electoral cycle, I think Keir Starmer has got to say no to all comers and then provide a list of priorities for what we can do when we get in. The truth is, we don't know what we're going to find when we get there. So,
but there are choices that you can make, and there will be people who will say, many of them, Labour supporters, who will say, if a Labour government can't do this, even in the economic situation that we find ourselves, then what's the point of it?
But Jo, when this one's done, there are tens of them. We've had a Tory government for 14 years. Don't you think there's all sorts of hideousness we want to change?
Oh. There are all sorts of hideous things that should be changed, but this is a easy, hundreds of thousands of children living in poverty who wouldn't be living in poverty if you scrap this policy. And of course, Labour should lay out where are they going to pay for it, and that wouldn't be terribly difficult. For example, you could increase the returns on capital gains tax and dividends tax so that Rishi Sunak and multimillionaires like him aren't paying a far lower rate of tax than all of us sitting around this table and everybody watching at home. There is money there if you choose to say, here are specific taxes which we are going to raise, and that will fund this specific good. And that is what Labour should do, but are too scared to take on the very wealthiest and most powerful people in the country, it seems.
Well, you're not surprised, James, I disagree with you. I think what they know is what a challenge it is for a Labour government, for a Labour Party to win after the extraordinary drubbing that we got in 2019. There is no rational basis for how Labour has got to this point where we could possibly win a general election.
So you don't think
it will be a statistical miracle for us to win. So the idea that we are going to win by unravelling lots of good things, bad things that we would like to change for very good reason, that is a slippery slope.
All right, well, let's get Alex.
If you want to tax Rishi Sunak and people like him more so that you have fewer children in poverty, it says a lot about the values of your incoming government. People would say, and they would trust us more when we said, there's loads of things we want to unravel, but we need to take a look.
I'm sure you would understand why maybe I wouldn't be choosing to take advice from you on election strategy.
Maybe
all right, well, let me bring.
We haven't got.
Well, it is true, of course, that in 2019 Labour did lose the election catastrophically. Well, I think that's just because you lost the election for a multitude of reasons. In terms of Conservatives, would you listen to Suella Braverman? I mean, she may be one of those who might be the next Conservative leader if you lose the election.
I think what's been lost in this conversation that this policy wasn't retrospective. It was about people from a date if they went on to have a third child.
Is it right?
Well, I think you have to have a control of the public purse. And I think that people take responsibility for the choices they make in their lives. There is still child benefit for 2 children.
Yes, but I mean, as Gordon Brown said, the former Labour leader, there's too much focus on getting people back into work and not enough focus on raising salaries of those in work. We are talking, in many cases, about in-work poverty. Emma, I mean, what is the philosophical justification for a person who's in work and can claim benefits for 2 children, but not for a third?
Well, I mean, I think that's a reasonably fair question to ask, and I completely understand why the Labour Party is struggling with, whether or not to repeal this, because I think instinctively the vast majority of Labour frontbenchers do, oppose this policy and would like to see it gone. But as Siobhan said, it's about, when you can pay for it, how you can pay for it. I think if you're looking at the expense of bringing up children, this isn't a conversation you can have in isolation either. As you said, Jo, you need to be talking about salaries, but you also need to be talking about the cost of childcare, which is phenomenally out of control.
Alec?
Yeah, and taxing the backside off wealth creators, as suggested, he's not going to raise wages in companies.
A policy that Nigel Lawson brought in when he was Margaret Thatcher's Chancellor.
I mean, there is a whole debate to be had about how you tax unearned wealth against wealth, because, we are taxing those who go to work, often on not very much money, at huge levels, yet very wealthy people who get their income from other forms, from property, art, whatever, are not taxed at the same rate.
Would you like an incoming Labour government, if they win the election, to do that?
I think it's above my pay grade to say that.
Well, I don't know.
I think so.
Just before we go, we heard from John Glenn in the Commons, who hopes that payments will be made, final payments to victims of the contaminated blood scandal, by the end of the year. That's all we have time for today. I'll be back tomorrow for Prime Minister's Questions here on Politics Live.